This episode of the Better Every Shift podcast is sponsored by L3 Harris Technologies. When the heat is on, you go all in, and L3 Harris will be right there with you. The XL Extreme 400p radio is tailor-made to meet the most rigorous fire standards. Learn more at www.l3harris.com/fire. Now let's get in the show.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Better Every Shift podcast. My name is Aaron Zamzow. Next to me is my co-captain, the editor-in-chief of Fire Rescue One, Janelle Fosquet. Hi, Janelle.
Hi.
And today, Janelle, today is a mayday situation. We have Andy Beck with us, who is going to talk to us about maydays and performance under pressure. How you doing, Andy? Welcome.
Thanks, guys. I'm awesome. Excited to be here.
Well, Andy, you're a firefighter EMT. You're a shift training officer. You work with Mandan City Fire in North Dakota. You're also a live burn instructor. You teach thermal imaging, fire dynamics. Your background is actually in crew resource management. You've completed a lot of research on how people and organizations operate under stressful environments, which we'll talk about today. You've served as a staff member on the near miss reporting system. We'll talk about that. I got some good questions there. You just recently wrote an article for Fire Rescue One on practice makes automatic. And that's part of our special feature, special coverage on Mayday training. And that is now live on, I think it's firerescue1.com, Mayday Training Evolution. We'll put that in the show notes. But I'm excited to talk to you about this because, we were talking off camera and off before the podcast about, a lot of us think, hey, if I'm put in that situation, I think I would be able to do okay. And what has your research showed? This is a lot of the stuff you've devoted a lot of your career to, maydays and performing under pressure. And, so I guess let's talk about mayday training and why it's so imperative. What are the imperative parts of mayday training?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we need to realize about ourselves is that we're all really optimistic, biased for action people. And so left to our own devices, we think we're probably more capable than we are in those situations. But the important thing to understand is that when we hit a point physiologically above a certain level of heart rate, we're going to lose the ability to do rational thought. We lose the ability to have fine motor skills. And so, and that's a physiological fact. I could put somebody on a treadmill where they don't even have fear or anxiety. And if I get them to a certain point, they're going to see their performance degrade. Now, if they're fearing death and they're in the most stressful situation they've ever been in on the fire ground, to just think that we're going to be able to figure out a way to get out of that is optimistic at best, because we're not. You're physically not able to think in those ways at that point. The only thing you're going to do is you're going to go back to your instincts, and you're going to go back to motor pathways that you've built, and you're going to just react. And so if we haven't done a good job of building those blocks for you to use, they're not going to be there.
Yeah. The pathways that we hope that we've built, right? Not under pressure, which is why, when we talk about, a lot of departments will do Mayday training, but you have to make sure that becomes, that practice almost becomes mastery, right?
Yeah. And you see that a lot. Like we're busy enough on a lot of agencies, or maybe not busy enough, but we have a small enough amount of time dedicated to training that a lot of times we're working with people until they can do the skill, and then we move on. So when we crosswalk over to like other high reliability organizations or groups that do really, really risky things, a good analogy to the fire service is like carrier operations in the Navy. When you're doing training for those jobs in that dangerous environment, you're doing them until you can't screw them up anymore. Yeah. And that's a different threshold to work to. And sometimes we're spending just enough time to get where we can perform the task, and then we have to move on because we have other things that are dictating for our time. But
checking the box, essentially, right?
Yeah, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's the reality of it. There isn't very many fire departments in the country that have all day, every day to just do nothing but train.
Yeah.
We've got other things we have to do other than even calls. I mean, we've got inspections and public education, and there isn't any one of those things that aren't important. So you have to have that balance. But what we find is sometimes two things can happen. One, we haven't spent time training to a level where that becomes automatic for those skills. And we haven't really ever established a system in our department so that we have an expectation of what would happen.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all training to the same goal. Or the other thing that happens is we made the evolution too difficult, and we had people fail by pulling off gloves, ripping a mask off in panic. And once you've done that, you've built that motor pathway. That's just how it works. And if you've only done it once, it's not a very defined pathway, but it's there. And
it's a start, right? Like
it's a start.
Yep.
And so you can't say for sure that the person's not going to do that in a real situation now. And that's tough. And we see it a lot where there isn't really a huge focus on Mayday, and there hasn't been a ton of thought into it. We're just going to go through the motions of put people in a prop and have them go through the prop. And we're probably not realizing quite the level of monitoring that we need to do as a training officer. And we get people that all of a sudden panic and they pull a mask off or something. And then, when we see these things happen in the fire ground, I think sometimes you got to look back at how they did their training, and we may have accidentally programmed that in.
Well, yeah, that's really fascinating, because how do you find that balance so you don't make it so hard that you're creating those pathways for something really dangerous?
Well, I think the key is, so like we talked about in the article, one of the first things you have to do is you have to decide, like any good training is, start with the plan. Where are you going? You want to prepare people to be able to react in a Mayday situation when they aren't able to extricate themselves from a fire. So the next step is, well, what is your policy for that? Or what's the expectation? Well, what do you want guys to do? What are the guys and girls on the trucks and the engines supposed to do? Now that you have that standard, you train to it. But the key for answering your question, Janelle, is as you train to that standard, it's really important to use that crawl, walk, run. And everybody looks at it as like, if we make this too easy, then we're not going to get these people ready we got to get them ready to react in the shit, in the worst situation they're ever going to be in. But I mean, Aaron would second me. You can't take somebody into a gym and expect them to do a split snatch with like the max amount of weight that they're going to do the first time. And by starting with just a PVC pipe and moving all the way over to where they're going to do a personal record, you aren't making it too easy. You're slowly building a base of skills. And so I think two things can happen. One, we try to push it too far right away, and we're testing and versus training. The other part of it is, I think sometimes we have people going through a prop and we're not watching them enough to be able to stop them before they get to that point. And the key is, as that person's going through, if they're not comfortable, they haven't mastered that, and that panic is setting, and you've got to stop the evolution, put hands on them and tell them, hey, take a deep breath and calm down. You're in the fire station. You're not going to die. Relax. Let's start over, whether it's an entanglement prop or whatever it is. But I think one of the issues that we see is people want to make it so real, and you can get there where they're blacked out and there's noise and you're in a hot environment and everything, but you can't start there.
And looking at just taking kind of what you've already told us, let's put it in the context of morning checks, for instance, on your SCBA, right? We just had a great training where we just did some SCBA kind of operations where we took them through a little competency course.
Yep.
And it was really interesting we were doing this Mayday situation, and we would kind of take someone out of the of line and have them call Mayday. And one of the first things that I saw right away were people were having difficulties just engaging their pass alarm. And as we as a crew started talking about this in the morning checks, a lot of people say, well, I engage it every morning, but they're looking at the pack.
Right.
The pack's not on them, and what you're saying is when that heart rate gets high, you go back to, you're thinking that the pass alarm is in front of you, when in actuality it's on your right-hand side, and finding where that button is. And so even with that morning check, you're saying, hey, take an extra 30 seconds, put the pack on and do it that way, because when it gets going and when your heart rate is up and when you can't think, that's what your reactions are. And put your glove on when you do it even,
Right.
correct?
Yes. Yeah, and when you're doing a survival course, make people set their pass alarms off when they're laying on them. Make people do it with their opposite hand or whatever. And it's funny because we've run that same type of drill, and I'll ask guys, tell me 2 different ways to set your pass alarm off. And they'll say, well, I, push and hold the button and I can do it with the pack off, and they rattle all that off. They're like, what's the other way? They're like, well, I don't know. There isn't another way. And I'm like, yeah, you lay still.
Don't move. 30
And it's
seconds.
like, oh yeah, I never thought it. So like, but unless you haven't practiced that, like, I mean, I probably wouldn't have thought of that either in that situation. And what are we all doing? We're thrashing around because our survival instinct is kicking in, and we're working really hard to try to fix the situation because we're all biased for action and optimistic people. I think in a lot of ways when you hear those stats about how people aren't calling a mayday, and we always have attributed it to they're so focused on winning, and they're paying attention to trying to get themselves out, and we got to change that mindset. I think for a lot of them, the reason why they're still struggling to try to get out and they didn't call a mayday was simple. It's because they never practiced doing it.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that card, if you don't have that slide there, you're not just going to invent it in that situation. So I think maybe across the fire service, it's been less of a they aren't thinking of it because we didn't do the training right, and more of a they never practiced that in that type of a situation. So they don't even it's not even on their radar to even think about.
Yeah, so even just going through calling a mayday, and I think in one of your articles you mentioned, hey, all right, here's some examples of it, because
Yep.
we're horrible at admitting that we want help on many levels, especially on a mayday situation. And so one of the things that you encourage, and I love this, is that hey, let's read other situations, and you can even go to the old YouTube and say, hey, what about you? If you're caught in this, are you going to call mayday? Yeah, what does that
Right.
sound like? So identifying, when to call a mayday. We talked about just the fine motor skills, and I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. Physiologically, what's going on to us as let's say stuff is getting bad, right? It's getting hot, or there's always that moment probably where a lot of us think we should, but what happens physiologically during those times?
So when our stress level rises or our heart rate goes up, or both of them, we're going to hit a point where we start dumping so many stress hormones and we go into that full-blown fight or flight. Your body's really good at not using what it doesn't need to use at that point. And so you're going to start to shut things down that aren't necessary. And what's really necessary for you to stay alive is to be able to fight and breathe and have your heart beat. And so your thought process in your brain is going to start to shut down to that, really those lower functions. So we're not going to be able to think through things at a certain level of stress and heart rate. We're going to start seeing sensory exclusion. It's different for everybody, but for most people, it starts with their field of vision starting to narrow. That's when we talk about tunnel vision.
Mm-hmm.
You have conversations with law enforcement officers that were in use of force incidents where they had to use lethal force. A lot of them will talk about how they didn't notice anything beside them. One of the next stresses we get is we get auditory exclusion. And we've heard about incident commanders in the middle of like a really stressful situation, and somebody was calling them on the radio. Somebody has to like elbow them and be like, Chief, they're calling you. We start dumping those other sensory things off because we don't need them. And we just continue to do that till we get down to the point where the only thing we're doing is preparing to fight, and we're feeding the brain. Heart's racing, we're breathing deep, and we're losing everything else. And so when we get in those situations, if we've done training in a situation like you're in, those slides are going to be there. And you can get really into the science of recognition, prime decision making and everything. But basically, when you get to that point, your brain does a good job of looking to see if it's ever been in that situation before. And if it has, it runs a quick simulation. Did it work last time? Yeah, it worked. That's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And that's where people are like, all of a sudden, it popped into my head what to do. And I knew that there was a window over there, and I went for the window and I got out. But if we've only done mayday training sitting in a kitchen table and we've never put gear on, we've never went out and got hot and uncomfortable, we've never had guys do push-ups and crawl through a prop and do some more push-ups until they're air bottles low and the bell's ringing or their vibra alerts going, and then we have them stop and try to call a mayday and set a pass alarm off. If we've never done that and worked them slowly to get to the point where they can be successful doing that, they're not going to figure it out in the middle of an actual situation.
Mhm.
Well, I think it's so interesting what you mentioned about the overconfidence too. Like there's a line in your article that I really liked that says, remember, when we are stuck, fall, or disoriented in a fire environment, we are generally unaware of how stuck or lost we
Right.
are or the distance of our fall. It's like
Right.
our perspective becomes
Yeah.
warped, and when we're in high stress situations. And, you know, just being able to think through those moments and think logically is out the window in a
Yeah.
way, which is like why it's ultimately called this practice makes automatic. So
Right.
your brain is just right there. I was thinking about a webinar we had last year where one of our panelists was detailing his Mayday experience. And I thought it was just such a genius example because he fell into a basement. He's trying to leave. He discovers that he's right next to some stairs and he goes up the stairs and then says he hits a wall. And he's just like, who would put a wall at the top of stairs? It was a door.
Right.
Of course, it's a door.
Yeah.
But his brain is not operating in this way that it's normally operating.
Couldn't comprehend it.
And it was such a good example of just how crazy things can get in a firefighter's mind in that moment.
For sure. And when we look at like situations where people did firefighter rescues and, or even, where somebody went in and made a grab and pulled somebody out, they never go as well as we think they're going to.
Oh God, no.
It's a mess. Some of those, I think there's the one serious accident report out of San Francisco. There was a lot of fire dynamics involved. It was that 2-story house where it auto extended on the backside. The crew that pulled the one guy out, like they're pulling him through the garage, and his air hose for his mask gets stuck into the tire of the car and holds him up and pulls his mask, like all those things happen like that. So we know that's going to happen. And we talk about it a lot, at least on our crew, that once we get to the scene, we don't control anything on the scene.
Yeah.
We don't control anything on the way to the scene. The only thing we can control is what we do to get ready and our training and how our system is as far as how we bunker up in the truck, the things we do when we get there, our expected actions, how good we are at deploying hoses to the door, remembering to take tools, whatever our system is. But you don't control anything. You don't control the traffic. You don't control the route to the fire. You don't control anything that happens on scene. That all we can do is react to. And so the better prepared we are to be able to handle a situation, because if you're going to think your way through, you're going to come up to the door and it's going to be a wall.
Yeah. Do you have any techniques that you give your students, or maybe you use? Personally, I've been really focusing on just taking a couple deep breaths as we're going on scene. Once you get in your gear, what kind of things do you recommend for those listening? Like, sometimes I do get hyped up. What's something I could do immediately to help change that?
I think, well, first of all, and this has applications like in the management realm, dealing with employees and not getting upset. And then it has, obviously in the emergency services on a call too. But I think breathing is huge. And we just had a class the other day we were doing with some of our new guys, and this came up, and I told them, I said, the two that I've seen work really well for people is the 2 breaths in and 1 breath out, and that's a good air conservation technique. You take a breath in, pause. When you feel like you need more air, you take an additional breath in, pause, exhale all of it out, and start over. That one works really well for air conservation. The other one is box breathing. Just think of like a 4-sided box. Take a breath in, pause when you go down, breathe out, pause when you go up, and it gives you something to focus on. And it's funny because on our shift, one of the guys that I work with all the time, I make fun of him for it all the time because we talk about this and I use him for it as an example, and he swears he doesn't do it. But if it's sounds like a significant EMS call or heading to a fire, he will, on every single call, once he's either ready to go or if it's a fire, once he's bunkered up, he always goes and claps his hands together. And that's like his way of unconsciously just calming himself. Then it works. Like you'll
It
just
does.
see him just level out. Then he's ready to go, you know?
There's a heart rate variability training. There's some apps
Yes.
out there that if someone's you go like, what is he talking about? He normally doesn't bring up smart things like that, but yeah, actually, HRT or heart rate variability. I have this app. It's like this circle, and it glows as it
Yep.
wants you to breathe in, and then it holds, and
Yep.
then it goes out. And honestly, 5 breaths, 4 breaths, whatever just focusing on that makes a huge difference in. For me, it's how I speak on the radio. It slows me down, and that's one thing that it goes along with the box breathing, and it goes along with the two in and one out. I think they're all very, very good tools. And it's interesting that, even doing that without air, or even when we're dealing with other issues, it can help
Oh yeah.
tremendously.
No, and it's funny because like I got a buddy of mine who teaches for a company, and I do some work with them doing like high reliability organizations performing under stress. And he's a military guy, and he always jokes that he's like, I mean, it's yoga breathing. It's been around for thousands of years, but he said,
Yeah.
you can have a yoga breathing class and you won't get, military special forces guys or firefighters to show up. But if you call it tactical breathing, they all
Oh
sign up for
yeah.
the class.
Oh yeah.
And he
Yeah.
said
You got
it's
a
the
waiting
same
list
thing.
on that. Yeah. And it's interesting, working with athletes back in the day. One of our college classes, we had to study. There's a particular sprinter in California who would run 100 meters, and after every race, he would pass out. And he was setting records, and it was unbelievable. Nobody could figure out physiologically what was going on with him. And then finally, someone watched the video and said, "Hey, he's not breathing at
Yeah.
all through the race." And high stressful situations, we all act differently in some cases. And I've noticed that with sometimes in people in exercise, they get amped up, or they focus so much they stop breathing.
Yeah.
And that can happen. You could see that too on the fire scene, where people get so amped up
Yep.
that they forget to breathe. Now you're on SCBA, and now you're behind the 8 ball. So really, along with some of the takeaways we've already talked about, is change the way you do your morning checks just to make it more to simulate game time, and then also focus on breathing in
Yeah.
everything you do. I think it can really make a huge impact. And you mentioned one thing too about having trainings about when to call maydays. And I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that. In your experience and in your research, what are some of the best, I shouldn't say best because those aren't good situations, but what are the situations that you recommend or that you like to use as examples?
So we always want to. Bert Clark did a bunch of really good work on this from the National Fire Academy back in the day, and I think it's important to you have to have trigger points, and the military does this a lot with trigger points are good in general, but I think when you're looking at something like this, you have to have trigger points established ahead of time. And when Dr. Clark looked at it with Navy and Air Force and Marine Corps pilots, they have ejection parameters, and so
Okay.
to try to narrow it down and force that, you need to pull the handles when this happens. They're if then statements. If this situation happens, you're below so many thousand feet and the aircraft is out of control, then eject. And so to walk those over to fire, the ones that we always talked about are: if you're stuck, then call a mayday. If you have a fall of any distance, then call a mayday, like Janelle brought up. You don't know how far you fell. So stuck, fall. If you're lost and you can't immediately regain orientation or the hose line, call a mayday. And if your low air alarm sounds, call a mayday. Because we know enough now that we should be using a point of no return where we're beginning to leave where we are in the fire at about our 50% in our cylinder. So if we're getting down to where our low air alert is going off, we don't have enough left possibly to get out. So any of those situations, so stuck, lost, fall of any distance, or a low air alert, you'd want to call a mayday. And best case scenario, you figure your way out and you can cancel it.
And
if you can bump heads with the RIT team on the way out, that's a good day. But at least you had help coming,
Exactly. I think probably the hardest one is when you're lost, to really think about, am I really lost? And if you have to ask that question, you probably are, right? So call it.
Yeah.
Worst case scenario, you said you hit heads with a RIT team.
Right.
Yeah. And But at the same time, those are great trigger points, but they're not the only ones. I assume we don't want people to think like, okay, well, I'm in this terrible situation, but it doesn't
Right.
match any of the four, so I guess
Right.
I shouldn't call. I mean, if your gut is telling you to call,
Right.
call.
Yep. Yeah, because it's like we look at. It's always been interesting because you look at how people think about responding to an incident, right? People will say, "Go ugly early," like I want more resources than I think I need. I can turn them around.
Mhm.
But then we get to a mayday situation, and then we're reluctant. So it's the same theory. Let's throw everything we can at it to solve the problem. And if we don't need that, that's fine. But we're better off that we know that that person's in trouble and we can send resources their direction. Then by the time they finally call out, it's a situation that's almost not solvable anymore. And
Yeah.
we have to realize that we're also going to have to practice this to the point where people have been uncomfortable before and then done it. Because if we haven't gotten them to the point where they are sweaty and they're bunkered up and they're doing work and they're stuck and they're getting frustrated, to remember to do it. That's the situation we want them in when we do training. But again, we got to slowly get to there. You can't just put them in that the first day. But we want to get people to the point where they're in a situation that mimics as much as possible what that situation will be like in an actual situation where they have to call Mayday.
When safety is top priority, you need more than a radio. Meet the XL Extreme 400P, tailor-made to meet the most rigorous fire standards. This radio withstands blasts of heat up to 1700 degrees and repeated 3-meter drops. Built with material from both their space division and their tactical comms, this is one tough radio you're going to need. Schedule your demo today. Visit www.l3harris.com/contact-us.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You're reading my mind here. Practice makes automatic, and I almost want to say perfect practice makes automatic.
Yeah, right.
Correct. In
Right.
this case, I think that was actually a Lombardi line,
Yeah.
something similar to that. But so let's
It's a
take
good Wisconsin quote. I'm proud of
It's
you.
a great Wisconsin quote.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's right.
we got to get them in where we can. There's not many. Well, there's a lot, but
There's a
not
few.
There's a ton.
they're not usually motivational though. So
Yeah, true.
yeah. But when you talk about you got your recruit, and I think you touched on this, like, hey, we're just going to teach them the basics of what the SCBA are, what they can do. But take me through it. You got to recruit to first year, third year, like, how would you recommend people starting to get someone from that? It's almost like getting them to crawl to run, and it's like a theory practice mastery almost in a way, correct?
Well, and I think the key is like you titrate the amount of stress in the scenario to how experienced and able they are to soak it up. So if I have a person who's barely spent any time, like we had 2 guys that are going through the academy that stopped at the station the other day. They wanted to do a little bit of extra training, and one of them was like, "I'm using up so much air. What do I do?" And he was kind of looking for some magic bullet. And I was like, "Well, I said, cardio is going to play a role, but I said, honestly, right now, you're just so anxious in that environment because it's so foreign to you that I said, you just need to calm down and just get used to it."
Mm-hmm.
And he's like, "Well, what do I do?" And I said, "Wear an air pack more. Like you're
Yeah.
just going to have to spend more time in that environment." So like for somebody like that, to have him practice calling a Mayday, I could pretty much just put him in his gear and probably have him crawl around on the floor for 5 minutes and then go through the thing. And he would have enough of a stress level that that's all he would need. Where, if I took some of the folks on our department that have been around for a long time and are really experienced, they're going to have to be in a full blown prop, and they've probably been in that prop before. So even them just going through that entanglement prop probably isn't going to be enough to really get them worked up. We're probably going to have to put them in an entanglement prop, and when they come out of it, turn them around a little bit, have their vision degraded, put them in a building where we've got it super hot with a heater or something, and we're going to have to create stress that way because those guys and gals are going to be used to that environment. But we want to make sure we get them to the point where they're uncomfortable and they're struggling a little bit without getting to the point where they completely fall apart, panic, to start pulling gloves and ripping masks off and stuff like that.
Yeah, because then you got to go backwards.
Yes.
And go back to that fundamental. And you mentioned too, sometimes we try to get a little too fancy before that a particular person's ready. And so you just build a solid foundation, and even like I was saying, I go back to that SCBA because I just saw firsthand how, how easy it is to say, all right, yeah, I know how to operate and activate my SCBA,
Right.
my pass alarm. Yeah, you do. But when it's sitting on a chair in front of you or a bench in front of you, as opposed to it being on, so fine
Yep.
tuning maybe trainings and fine tuning what we do every day can go a long way into helping us through the mayday. And
One of the
you had
first
mentioned,
times I really realized that was I worked in wildland fire for a long time and lived in a national park for a while. And one of the law enforcement rangers was, he was watching a baseball game. He called and he's like, "Hey, you want to come over and watch a game and have a beer?" And he's standing in his living room watching the game, and he's got his duty belt on and he's drawing his sidearm and putting it back. Drawing his sidearm. And I go, "Dude, what are you doing?" And he goes, "Well, we just got new holsters." And there was a specific sequence to pull it out to get it out of the holster. And he's like, they had been told, you guys need to unholster and holster like 100 times to build that new motor pathway, to have that be automatic. So in a bad situation, you're not thinking your way through it. So it's the same thing as like, put your gloves on and set that pass device off a few times. Some training when you're doing a live burn and you come out, if there's a spot when everybody's done and it's not going to raise an alarm, guys are all sweated up. Hey, why don't you guys all set your pass alarms off and then practice resetting them? Go through one of those situations, because then they're in a more realistic situation than they would be, like you say, sitting in a t-shirt and EMS pants with your boots on, in a climate controlled environment inside of the truck at 8:30 in the morning with your coffee mug in one hand, checking packs.
right, telling stories,
Right, for sure.
shooting the
That's the
breeze,
best part of the day, but
Right. I do want to say you guys watch football a little differently there in North Dakota than most, but with the pistol thing. But
Yeah.
I get the point though, right?
Yeah.
Like, you again, there's a theory, then you practice it, and you practice it until you. And I think we had mentioned this earlier. You practice it till you can't get it wrong, not so you get it right. You practice it so you can't get it wrong. And we were talking before the podcast, and you think that's where a lot of people kind of take the wrong approach to mayday training, correct? Like
and I don't, and I mean, I think it's just the reality of the situation. We don't have the ability maybe sometimes to dedicate as much time to it. I don't think it's because anybody is, by and large, isn't because they don't take it seriously.
Yeah.
It's a resource thing. We just don't have the time to spend on building that foundation. Because like when you look at like training athletes, they always talk about like the performance pyramid, right? Mm-hmm. If that base isn't built correctly, that person will be able to increase their performance, but at some point it might topple because you have those bad habits and you haven't built that really good base. So by building that base, then they can continue to perform up to the peak of it. But if you don't have that good base, you're going to limit yourself at some point. And so I think sometimes like we've got other demands in our time and other demands for training and things we've got to go do. And maybe we didn't spend enough time on mayday training and operating in that environment. And so we don't have that base. So then when we get tested, we necessarily aren't to where we want to be or where we think we are.
Yeah. I think the big thing is just don't cut corners on it. And,
right.
And you had mentioned too, like know what your policy is, because every department runs them a little bit differently. Some say lunar, some say who, what, where.
You can.
Yep. And so make sure you understand that part of it. You had mentioned props though. What are some of the props that you guys use to help kind of simulate this?
One of the props we use is just, and I honestly don't really know where it came from, but it's 3 stud walls that are like 3 stud bays wide by about 4 foot tall. And those are like 3 in a row. And then there's side braces on them. So you're able to crawl through and people can either, go backwards through them or they can, rotate sideways through it. They can crawl through and then you can put different entanglements through and you just make them crawl through, whether they're crawling through sideways or they're going through the stud walls. And what it does is it just gives them a task to do. And then while they're doing that, at some point, if they get stuck and they can't make it through something, or you can start them with a bottle that doesn't have as much air in it. So they hit their point where they have a low air alarm. And then you can have them where we've got a prop where they go up some steps and then there's like the 2 trap doors and there's the rope. And there's a bunch of foam blocks inside there. So they crawl up and then once they get all the way out there, you pull the rope. And that one's fun because the people that have been there before, when they start going up the stairs, they know it's coming. And so then they push and they could feel it. And then you got to try to entice them out there and pull the rope. But we always try to make sure that at some point through whatever course you set up, they all are going to hit a parameter. And so for some of the people that are really good, it's as simple as just making sure you have like a rubber strap. And at some point you just hook an SCBA and just tug on them and make them keep going. And the dudes are strong and the girls are strong and they're trying to, strong like bull, try to go through, and you just keep pulling back and you finally just ask them, are you getting anywhere? No, I think I'm stuck. Okay, what are we supposed to do? Yeah. And so even though you coached them into calling it, like they're still in their gear, they still were crawling through something and had that stimulus, and they still call it that it works. But like the temptation, I think, is that we see a situation like that, or we don't have them blacked out and we're like, well, this is too easy. You don't have to make it impossible. We just have to reinforce those scenarios. I mean, the Navy doesn't take guys out in an actual plane that's on fire going down and has them practice ejections. Like, you don't have to do that.
Right.
So we don't need to have it at that panic level every single time where we've got people losing their minds and building bad habits. We just have to put people in the correct environment, have that same stimulus, and keep repeating it. That's all it takes.
And then what's your comment to those who say, well, this will never happen. Like, this is so unrealistic. Why do I need to go through this?
How many things happen every day in our job that no one would ever thought would happen? You know what I mean? Right. I mean, that's why we're here. And like, and I hope it never does. I've never called a mayday. I'm 17 years into this and I haven't. I hope I never do. But, if we get ready for, I mean, the argument could be made, if you run EMS calls, why in the world do you have a OB kit then? I mean, how many people are actually going to deliver a baby pre-hospital? Not help somebody from an ambulance. Physically going to be, you're the only person there. And it's like, the odds of that are pretty small too, but we do routine training in that and we carry all the equipment for it because we have to be ready for it.
We have to be prepared for that. You just don't know, especially in our environment now I think is more unpredictable than ever. I mean, not only do we have to be prepared for, now we have lithium ion battery fires, and we have a lot of issues with, violence and mental health, and our environment is so unpredictable,
for sure,
which is why I think a lot of the key things we talked about don't just transfer to mayday. They transfer to performing better in general on our job. Right.
Well, and if you spend a whole bunch of time preparing for maydays, at the same time you're doing it, you're spending time in an air pack. You put your gear on, and if maybe you got everybody in a circle and had a race when we bunkered up. We donned a pack. We went through the procedures of going on air. We got done. We secured our pack. We put it away. We filled bottles. We moved as a crew. We communicated. We had to set off pass devices. We probably did some radio work. These are all things that we do every day. So like, by taking that person and putting them in that situation, maybe they never have a mayday, but maybe the fact that you just did all that radio work, they got more comfortable on their radio with their gloves on with an SCBA. And when something else happened, they were better able to communicate. You could hear them better. And it was because you did this. So none of these skills are ever in a vacuum. Like you said, Aaron, we're doing work that we do on a call. And so I think anytime you can take those building blocks and, you stick all the Legos together so it looks like a model of a mayday training, they're still the same Lego blocks that we would do for doing fireground survival or anything else.
Yep. Yeah. It's such an easy transfer. And, we just ran our SCBA drills I was talking about earlier, and it was really fun for me to step back as a training officer and watch people reluctant, like, this is the last thing I want to do today. Right. To go through a 15-minute course. And we got this cool smoke machine now. It's the drama smoke that actually is really, really cool because it's getting closer to mimicking. You really can't see anything, even if you use your lights. And this was like a new prop for us. And we sent everybody in, and when they came out, 15 to 20 minutes later, they all had these big grins on their faces. They're like,
yeah, absolutely.
It's great to do that. And it was very rewarding. And I'm sure you feel that every time, you see the face going in versus that face going out, and you go, this is a great training for us to do.
Well, and I always joke with guys. I mean, we've even done just tool trainings where, like, one of the trainings for the month will be just go, they'll have an assigned piece of equipment off the truck. We'll get it off, talk through how we use it, where it came from. And I tell guys all the time, the fact that you're pulling that fan or whatever it is off the truck isn't the point of it. The point of it is that after you've talked through how you set this ladder or whatever, if people are experienced, it probably takes 5 minutes. But then somebody goes, hey, you know what I saw one time? and they start talking about a story that happened, how it was used correctly or incorrectly. And then 15, 20 minutes later, you've covered all these scenarios that center around whatever it was that you got off the truck. I joke all the time. I'm like, all that is a prop to get everybody talking.
Yeah.
And I said, then that's actually the training. And like, our job is like telling stories is how we learn, essentially, more than any other job. When we look at our environment we work in, it's an experiential job, and any experiential job, tradition and everything is passed through stories. And so the ability to get people out hands-on doing a training, the stories that they tell about how that relates to something that actually happened, that's probably where the learning happens more than it sometimes it does even going through the hands-on training.
And speaking of that, I got one more question for you about, we were going to talk about the near miss reporting.
Yep.
What's the one story about a mayday that you read and went, this is like a perfect scenario to teach from? Do you have one in mind?
So they're probably one of the coolest ones that we ever had was, it was on a live burn, and it was a department where they had a recruit go in and he didn't have his SCBA completely secured. He wasn't used to how to secure it, and ended up breathing a bunch of smoke and kind of panicked. And then they got the guy. I mean, obviously not an issue. Controlled environment, ended up being fine. No smoke inhalation problems or anything, treated and released. But what was interesting is we got a cluster of 5 reports. And so we got a report from the recruit. We got a report from his company officer. We got a report from the live burn instructor that was with him. We got a report from the guy coordinating the live burn that day and from the chief of training. So what was interesting was to see how this somewhat minor incident not only rippled through that department, but how everybody saw a different side of it and how it impacted them. Like the upper levels were looking at it as like, we need to review how we're training these guys. We need to review how we're monitoring things. The live burn instructor was looking at it from the standpoint of like, do we need to change how we do go no checks? So it went from very strategic all the way down to tactical. And when you read the recruit, he was like, I should have paid more attention. I should have double checked that I knew better and everything else. But it was interesting because they all got something different. They took a different take of it. And so by sharing that story, though, whatever level you're at, like you look at that one incident, there's all these lessons that came from just that one single thing. That chief of training could have went and done a seminar on, how close are we to having our training program fall apart? We think we have this incredible thing built. The recruit could do a class for other recruits about like, pay attention to every single thing somebody's teaching you because it all matters. Don't blow any of it off, So it was that's the one working in the program as long as I did that always stuck out in my mind.
Yeah. So you almost saw on every single level, each of them kind of went back to, what do we need to do to kind of tighten up, right? Like
Right.
what, the recruit, I need to pay more attention on how to click that in.
Yep.
The instructor was, we need to make sure we place emphasis on certain things,
Yep.
And then
Buddy checks and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. And hopefully departments don't have to go through that. They can listen to this podcast
Right.
and then go back and have a conversation and say, hey, what do you think? Like, could that happen here? And let's look up and let's look up through the chain and what is our policy?
Right.
And let's encourage our people to start making their morning checks more realistic.
Right.
Like, and this is awesome stuff, brother. Appreciate all this. We at the end of every podcast, after we I shouldn't say abuse and use you, we get what we need out of you. We like to dig in a little bit more and have a little bit of fun and do something called hot seat questions. And these are questions that sometimes come from our listeners. Janelle's mom and my mom are our 2 favorite listeners. So they have questions sometimes that we throw in there. So we're going to put you in the hot seat. Janelle's going to start us off, man. This is great. Appreciate everything. This is really valuable stuff for anybody listening.
All right, Andy. Well, you have offered us some great advice today. So I would like to know who you call when you need advice. Do you have a go-to person?
Yeah, I've got
Or
a couple.
people?
I've got a guy that works for a company called Mission Centered Solutions. Mark Smith is his name, and they do consulting for like high reliability organizations. And he's always been a really good mentor. So whether it's anything along like the lines of doing what I do, or just personally and like professionally, I call him a lot. He's one of those people that's really good at not just giving you advice, but making you realize like politely where you screwed up. And he'll ask a couple questions and you'll be like, crap. Yeah, you're right. So
Yeah. He likes to put the mirror up and just go, here
yeah,
you go. Take a look.
yes, 100%.
Yeah, we've all been there. Those are
Yeah.
those are
Janelle does
interesting
that to
moments.
me every day that
No.
Yeah. And actually let's piggyback on that one. So looking at it in a mirror, what's the biggest what are you trying to improve on every shift? Like what's your major focus right now?
I think the biggest thing is like, and my job outside of the fire department is I work at a ski area and I lead all the outside operations. And I think one of the big things is learning to listen more. I'm like type A, super outgoing. And what I've learned like the last probably 4 or 5 years is like how different I communicate than people that are like introverts are, and how easily those people can just get run over like in the fire service. And whether that's teaching that from the standpoint of like an after action review and how we structure those so everybody has a second to be able to say what they want to say, or just, I mean, I've got examples from the ski area where we'll be at a meeting and there's somebody I know, one of our folks, like he needs like a 10-second pause. And so we'll get done and I'll just literally be like, so what else? And you have to wait like that. It's probably like 2 seconds, but it feels like 4 hours to me.
Right.
And then he'll be like, yeah, I was gonna, and it's unbelievable. And I know that like he won't even bring that up unless he has that moment. And so like I think that's when I even read the book. There's a book called Quiet, and it's all about that. But yeah, just learning that other people don't communicate like loud and super fast like me, you know.
Yeah, super important, right, Janelle? Janelle can relate to that one a little bit.
All right, let's shift it up just a little bit here. Have a little fun. I want to know your 2 desert island movies.
Ooh.
One being a fire service movie and one a non-fire service movie.
Non-fire service, probably one of the last 2 Star Wars movies. I've always been a fan of that, and I think yeah, either one of the last 2. And then fire service, I think probably Ladder 49, because that's like kind of, I think that's my generation of Backdraft, because like Backdraft was like, you know, a little bit before me, but Ladder 49 was sort of like they rinse and repeat for people that were my age. So
Those are
They'll
good
probably
ones.
just the next generation, they'll redo Backdraft with different actors. It'll be
100%,
like,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
Kevin Hart and The Rock or whatever. I don't even know
Right.
who it would be nowadays. All right, one more final question on the hot seat. What's your favorite thing about the fire service?
I think my favorite thing about the fire service is that you never have to grow up. I tell people that all the time. I'm like, we've come back from calls at like 3 a.m. and somebody would be like, should we have root beer floats? God, it's a brilliant idea. We should. So you're, you know, making root beer floats at 3 a.m. And then when you come in the morning, the next shift comes in and you're like, God, we had a busy night. We only had one call. But we had root beer floats. They're like, oh, dude, I wish I would have been here. And I always tell people, like, if you were an accountant and you showed up for work in the morning, everybody's like, oh, how was your day, Bob? It was, you know, last night was fun. I got up at 3 a.m. and had root beer floats. He would be like, well, that was really irresponsible. But if you work in the fire service, other people are like, why wasn't I there? You should have called me. So yeah, you don't really, you don't really ever have to completely grow up. So, and it's what I've discovered is because of that, it's a collection of some of the smartest people that just don't have regular jobs. And so it's pretty cool because whether working in wildland or working in structural, like some of the people you work with and run into are just incredible people and could be doing a lot of other things, but they choose to do this job. And it's amazing like how smart they are and how intellectually curious they are. But yeah, I don't ever want to grow up. So that's the best part.
That's awesome.
I thought I was going to get you on that one, but boy, you had that front and center. That was awesome.
Janelle sent me the list. So
yeah, she's cheating. She's cheating.
Actually,
I just came up with that one on the fly. So
nice.
that was pretty good. Hey man, thanks so much for all your insight. This is great conversation, and hopefully those that were listening, they should be benefiting from this and implementing some of the things that you had talked about. And Janelle, this is all part of a special coverage, correct? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we've got our Mayday training series coming up, and we've got a whole host of articles and videos. Obviously, this podcast is a big part of it. It's sponsored by L3 Harris. We appreciate their support. So please, yeah, check it out, firerescue1.com/mayday training evolution. And that'll be in the show notes.
Cool.
Thanks, Andrew. Any parting words of wisdom for members of the fire service going forward about training or growing? Or
I think the biggest thing, just try to do something every day, and don't feel bad if it's not something major. It's like you tell people, Aaron, you probably told them, about physical training, something, go do something, get out, touch something, pick up some piece of equipment, talk through a scenario. And the more times we do that, we're going to bond our crew together tighter. We're going to get better and better, every day. So.
And that's really what we're about. That's how this podcast got
Yeah.
started. We're about trying to improve every single day, every single shift. For those listening, you can email us at bettereveryshift@firerescue1.com. Please rate and review the show. If you're listening to this, remember you can watch us on video at YouTube or on firerescue1.com. And to just reiterate what Andy has said, and almost every guest that we've had, it's the most important thing is to learn something, do something, and share something to make you and those around you better every shift. Thanks for listening, everybody.